advocacy group, Open Secrets, has raised questions about the over 3 billion rand worth of South African arms. These were exports to Israel's allies. Now, this as the Israel-Hamas, including Hezbollah wars, rage on, threatening a wider Middle East conflict. Let's talk now to Open Secrets lawyer, Abongile Nkamisa, who joins us from Cape Town. Ms. Nkamisa, good evening to you and thank you for your time. I think for the benefit of viewers, I'm going to try and keep my questions as simple as is possible so that everyone is taken along. What do we know about South Africa's relationship with Israel when it comes to the sale of weapons?
Thank you so much for having me, Xoli. As far as our knowledge goes, South Africa does not directly supply or trade arms with Israel. However, it does trade a huge bulk of arms with Israel allies such as Germany and the United States of America, as been demonstrated by the article that we wrote, which details just how much of the stock goes to the United States and Germany. This is like billions worth of stock of arms that go to Germany. And what makes this even harder is that there is no way for the current, arms regime in South Africa that can trace whether the arms we trade with Germany and the United States actually end up in the United States and Germany, or they are retraded and go into other locations such as Israel. Yeah. So as far as our goes, that is what we know currently.
All right. Now you've helped me come to the next logical question, and that is the worry by Open Secrets. Why does the advocacy group believe that there is a risk that these South African manufactured weapons could either be sold or transferred to Israel by the countries you've mentioned?
Yeah. So most alarmingly, Xoli, our arms regime control measures such as the policy that we have is ineffective. It has proven to be ineffective. And this is not only an occurrence that Open Secrets notes now, this is also something Open Secrets has fully discussed now in our previous report, Profiting from Misery, where we undertake and highlight comprehensively just how ineffective the system is. So insofar as the system is concerned, when South Africa sells arms to these nations that I mentioned prior, there is a tool that the South African government is supposed to use, which is called the end user certificate. So basically, that is a very important tool to trace and to trace where ultimately the arms are used or end up. So what we have in the South African system currently is there is no way for us to monitor or to see where our arms ultimately end up. So in the report that I mentioned prior that Open Secret has drafted, it highlights how when South Africa was trading arms with the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, and they tried to enforce the end user certificate, they couldn't. And because Saudi Arabia didn't agree to the terms that were on that end user certificate, and the South African government ended up caving to those demands and rejecting or removing the clause which would allow for us to inspect and trace where our arms ultimately end up. So this is a situation we are faced with as well when we look at the situation in Israel and the people of Palestine.
All right. So you've mentioned two important points there, and that was my worry that we're going to lose the viewers somewhere. So let me start with the end user certificate, and I just want to explain what it is exactly before I pose the next question. The end user certificate is basically a documented undertaking between a country that is selling arms and the purchaser of the arms. And what it effectively means is that a purchasing country needs to agree that the munitions, or in other words, weapons, bought will not be transferred any further without the selling country's permission. Now, are you saying that South Africa has no way of knowing and has no way of being notified that their weapons that they may have sold to America or Germany, those weapons are possibly going to be transferred to Israel. Are you saying that there's no mechanism to monitor that?
Yeah. Precisely that, Xoli. And this has also come up previously in parliamentary meetings where basically the NCACC, which is the committee that sits and decides on whether they trade with a particular country on arms, they admitted that they don't have the mechanisms or they lack resources to ensure that they monitor and ultimately follow the trail of where the arms ultimately end up. And this is our concern as Open Secrets.
So let me then get to the other element, because for now, we're talking about the sale of weapons to countries such as America and Germany, and these are countries that have been steadfastly in support of Israel in its ongoing war in Gaza and Lebanon. Now, we are talking about a previous sale of weapons by South Africa to the UAE. This is the United Arab Emirates. And this is the point that you touched on. And I just want to read what your report said in part there. And you are saying, I'm quoting directly now, Open Secrets revealed the numerous instances in which South African weapons formerly exported to the UAE were being used by local militias in Yemen. Now, the UAE was one of several states, along with Saudi Arabia, to publicly refuse any inspections by the South African authorities to monitor the terms of the end user certificate. If South Africa was refused to inspect as to whether their weapons were transferred and possibly landed up in the hands of militias in Yemen, do we know whether they made any efforts beyond that, or they simply left it at that?
So ultimately, what we know about South Africa is they caved to the demands of the UAE and Saudi Arabia when it came to making these demands, and there hasn't been evidence of them taking any further steps to prevent South African arms ultimately ending up in those conflict zone and war-torn areas.
So the bigger context here, Ms. Nkamisa, is that South Africa, the South African government, we know it has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice, and they argued there that Israel is committing genocide against the people of Palestine. If any of its weapons were either transferred or sold to Israel by the countries we've mentioned before, do you think there is a duty on the South African government to demand that they inspect, and beyond that, they are told, as per the end user certificate, that their weapons are not going to be taken to Israel in any way, shape or form, especially on the back of that case at the ICJ?
Precisely because South Africa took a very clear stance when it comes to what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank and in Israel as well. There is an ethical and moral, but more than that, there is an international obligation for them to ensure that the systems, specifically concerning the arms trade globally, their systems are secured, their systems are not defeating the purpose that South Africa is trying to serve in the global community, because they're the first country that really took a stance into saying that what is happening in Palestine and how the devastating effects of innocent Palestinians being killed would mandate that they have secure systems that they themselves can confidently say and state that none of our arms are being traded or none of our arms are being used to kill these, innocent civilians. And this is a point that, Open Secrets is making in the article that we released, but also in our work as well, in that our system is not fit for purpose. In as much as we, took a very brave stance when it comes to what is happening since, October last year, our systems are still not living up to that moral and ethical, but more importantly, the international human rights law system and humanitarian law. So they would have to be, they would have to take note of how can this be, better improved? How can this be more effective?
Yeah. So if we use the previous case in the UAE or Saudi Arabia, and your wording here is that the South African government simply caved when these countries refused inspections. Now, Germany and the United States, these are some of the major trading partners with South Africa. If these governments were to say, sorry, we can't allow you to do that here, to do that inspection, do you think the South African government would have the audacity to say, we have to do this, partly because we have a moral duty as per our case at the ICJ?
I think at this point, Xoli, there really isn't a way to tell on what the government of South Africa would do, particularly because they have, a deep interest in what is going on right now in Palestine. And ultimately, they would be forced to say something, or they'd be forced to take certain actions. But with previous examples, there really isn't a way to fully determine whether South Africa would, would want or would refuse to trade with these countries up until the whole ecosystem of their end user certificate is implemented in a way that is in line with international obligations and international law.
Finally, do we know if Open Secrets has asked these questions that we are pondering over tonight to this committee, the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, and what may have been the response?
Yeah, so one of our initial steps when we were writing the article was to approach the NCACC through information requests according to law using PAIA, where we try and access information in the public interest that we would use to write a full comprehensive report. But however, that request was denied by the NCACC on the basis that it contained information that could jeopardize security, or that could raise security concerns. And there's an over-reliance on some of the exemption clauses as well in PAIA law that allows state entities or private entities to refuse information when state security or geopolitical information, they wouldn't want geopolitical information out in public. So our steps moving forward is to try and proceed with that process. But however, when we started this process, it was just before the elections of May, and then our request was rejected, and then we filed in an internal appeal request, and that internal appeal request was never responded to. And as far as we know, between May and October of this year, there wasn't a functioning NCACC committee that sits and looks at these trade agreements and these end user certificates. It wasn't functional. Upon discovering that, we wrote a letter to the presidency, because the NCACC in itself, its composition is elected and is appointed by the government. We only found out that now the government has elected people that will sit as part of the NCACC. And we haven't received a response on our request. So our work is to further pursue that level of accountability to see whether a response is going to be different this time around with the new elected and composed NCACC.
Abongile Nkamisa, thank you very much for your time.